Continuing our big story tonight, tough talk from the man who ran the Pentagon twice. With presidential politics heating up, battles raging across Syria, and tensions mounting between Israel and Iran, who better to talk about all this than Donald Rumsfeld? And on this D-Day anniversary, we'll also talk about the cause that's closest to his heart, his support for America's wounded warriors. A little later, top Democrat Debbie Wasserman Schultz joins me for her first interview since the failed Wisconsin recall. She'll tell me what she thinks went wrong for her party and why she says the vote still sent a message to Scott Walker. We'll begin with our big story, big questions for Donald Rumsfeld, who was, of course, Secretary of Defense under Presidents Gerald Ford and George W. Bush, and is the author of Known and Unknown, a memoir now out in paperback. Mr. Secretary, welcome back to the show.
Thank you very much. Good to be with you.
Let me start straight off the top with your reaction to Wisconsin. What does it mean? We're 5 months today away from the election. What does it really mean in the bigger context of that election?
Oh, I think it's a little early to tell for sure, and I guess I've been out of politics for quite a while, but as I observed it, it seemed to me that the governor announced what he was going to do, was elected, went in and did it, and then there was a great deal of opposition marshaled against him for doing what he had said he would do and for what the people of Wisconsin voted for him to do. And then this recall was set up. And my impression is that what took place is the people of Wisconsin decided that they did, in fact, vote for him to do what he did, liked what he did, and wanted to support him. What the implications will be for the presidential election is really unclear to me. It certainly was a defeat for the labor unions that were so active opposing him. And it was interesting to me that the President of the United States was, a half an hour away from Wisconsin, but didn't believe it was in his personal interest to go in and give the Democratic candidate who was opposing Walker any support. So the Obama administration must have concluded that the president would be better off not being associated with that recall and hitting it fresh as president.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem a strange decision by the White House, because whichever way you look at it, I've got Governor Walker on the show tomorrow night, in fact, to discuss this in more depth. But in terms of what he said today, he said this was about leadership. For the reasons that you stated earlier, he decided to take a principled position, whether you agree with it or not, and he stuck to his guns. And even when there was a recall, he continued to stick by them, and he won the day. You would have thought, so close to an election, that President Obama would have done everything he could to stop that happening, because what it has done, it's given the Republicans a real tonic, hasn't it? It's sort of revved everybody up and put them into battle mode.
I think that's probably true. I think that there was a great deal of effort that went into it within the state, by the people of that state, and there was some support from outside. And the only thing I can guess is that while it would have been very easy for the president to go in and offer his support, he probably made a decision that it was better in his long-term interest, in terms of the upcoming election in November, to not get involved in what he probably guessed would be a losing case.
Now, you've said that President Obama is one of the weakest, if not the weakest, president of your lifetime. Do you actually mean that?
I was asked by somebody if I thought that the current president was the weakest president. And I said I thought the competition probably was President Carter. That the two presidencies did not have the energy or the leadership. I mean, think of President Obama on many pieces of legislation. Instead of fashioning a piece of legislation, taking it to the Congress, recommending it, urging it, working it through, he kind of left it to the Congress to figure out what those pieces of legislation that he considered his major priorities ought to be. He didn't fashion them. He didn't take the leadership. And that I found kind of unusual for a president to do. I think the other big example was his decision to, quote, lead from behind in Libya, where the argument was made that it was a humanitarian effort. And of course, it lasted much longer than it would have lasted had they said at the outset that Gaddafi would be gone when it's over. Now, fortuitously, Gaddafi is gone now that it's over, but I think all the people in that country were very reluctant to support the dissidents and the revolutionaries, the people who were opposing Gaddafi, because they didn't know whether or not Gaddafi would be there when it was over. And they had families and businesses, so they were very reluctant. True of the military, true of the diplomats, true of business people. And I think that absence of leadership undoubtedly prolonged that activity.
Yeah, but there'll be people here watching this, Mr. Secretary, saying, hang on a second. Donald Rumsfeld was part of the George Bush war machine that rampaged into Iraq and cost a lot of American troops their lives with a on-the-boots attack on the ground against Saddam Hussein, which most people think now was a mistake. If you compare that to what you've just said as a criticism of President Obama in Libya, very, very different. You know, he decided not to sacrifice any American lives, not a single American troop's life was lost. Gaddafi was overthrown, which was the objective, in the same way that the overthrowing of Saddam was the objective. And people will say, actually, we prefer President Obama's way. That is a better use of the American military. It was just as successful, and it caused much less economic and military pain to America.
And of course, the circumstances are entirely different. You're talking apples to oranges. You got to remember, when Saddam Hussein was finally captured and pulled out of that spider hole in Iraq and given to the Iraqi people and the Iraqi government, and they tried him, convicted him, and sentenced him to death, it was Gaddafi in Libya who called in the West and said, I do not want to become another Saddam Hussein. I have a nuclear program. It's well advanced. And I am now inviting the West in to come into Libya and take over my nuclear program. I am giving it up. And that was a direct result of President Bush's decision to go into Iraq. And the world is a better place because Gaddafi did not have nuclear weapons and gave up his nuclear program specifically for that reason. Second, you now have in Iraq an imperfect situation, but you have a government that is respectful of the various elements within the country, that's democratic, that fashioned their own constitution, and apart from Israel, it's the only democracy in its early stages, immature to be sure, in the entire region.
See, in your book, you tell rather movingly the story about how your wife, Joyce, of 56, 57 years, had repeatedly, after 9/11, woken up and said to you, Don, where's Osama bin Laden? And my issue, I think, with you, when you say that President Obama is weak, is how weak can a president be when he ordered the hit on Osama bin Laden and he took him out? Only today we saw another senior Al-Qaeda member, Abu Yahya al-Libi, yesterday got taken out. This is a series of victories that President Obama's had, using predominantly, in this case, drone attacks, where again, there is no loss of life to American troops. It's a very different way of going about taking out the bad guys. And there are lots of people who say this is not a sign of weakness by President Obama. It is a more sophisticated and smarter way of deploying the American military than the one that you and George Bush deployed.
Well, you keep saying I said he's the weakest, and I've said once, and I'll say one more time only, that I was asked a question. In my adult life, if you look at the presidents, how would you rank them on that subject? And I said I would rank this president as a general leader up with President Carter. Now, you can phrase it any way you want, but the way you're phrasing it is twisting it in an inaccurate way. I did not volunteer this. I responded to a question and answered to the best of my ability. I think that what you're talking about, however, when I answered the question, it related to his presidency. It related to his handling of the economy, his handling of the Congress, and his handling of other matters. I have praised the fact that he took the capabilities that were developed by his predecessors, special operations forces, unmanned aerial vehicles, and used them properly with respect to attacking the compound in Pakistan that ended up killing Osama bin Laden. Anyone who sees that has to give credit for that and acknowledge that that was a success, and he's to be congratulated for it. I don't think it was a terribly tough decision. I don't think you spend 10 years investing money in special operations forces, investing money in intelligence, and then leave it to your successor, and then think that a successor would not go after Osama bin Laden, the face of Al-Qaeda, the man who masterminded the attack on America on 9/11. So I think he did the right thing, and I credit him for that. And certainly I'm delighted to see that al-Libi has been killed. But I was talking about the broader sense of a presidency, and I think you appreciate that.
Let's take a break. Let's come back and talk about Israel and Syria.